This video is a step-by-step, comprehensive tutorial on how to do relative filtering in Tableau, which is the 12th use case in Bethany Lyons' top 15 LOD expressions. There are two parts to this video. In the first part, we will go through and recreate the example in the white paper. The second part is an expanded discussion on relative period filtering, and we will create something like this. We're going to add a parameter to choose the maximum date to use. For example, we can choose today or the maximum record date from our data source. We're also going to add the ability to choose duration, so either year to date, quarter to date, month to date. We can also allow our viewers to choose which year to compare. Instead of week numbers, we're also going to display dates, and we are also going to add an ability to add labels to highlights. Many of our calculations will depend on what we call day of year. And right now, we don't see any difference when we are looking at January. February, all the numbers seem to be the same. But once we get to March, if you take a look at a leap year, right now we are seeing a one-off difference. So we are going to try to address that later on in the video. If you need a refresher on LODs or want to check out additional practical use cases, please check out the links in the description below to see several video tutorials that can help you get up to speed. I also have separate videos on the top 1 to 5 LODs, top 6 to 10 LODs, and also the top 11 use case. This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community for creative and curious people. Need inspiration for that next project? That next article you want to write? Or that next masterpiece you're going to draw? Skillshare's classes on creative writing, illustration, graphic design, production, film and video, and many more can give you that dose of inspiration and more. Data visualization is a topic I really enjoy learning more about. I remember pre-ordering this book from Nadie Bramer and Shirley Wu. I am just fascinated and inspired at how they think about data and how they choose to visualize data. To my pleasant surprise, Nadie Bramer has a course on Skillshare. Her course encourages students to think beyond bar and line charts and to really maximize visualizations for beauty and impact. I love what she said in the course. When she sees data, she sees mystery. And the course length is under an hour, which can easily be finished in a couple of lunch or coffee breaks. If you need that spark of inspiration, try Skillshare. The first 1,000 people to use the link in the description below will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. To get started, let's go ahead and download the workbook. You can find the link to the white paper in the description below. Let's go to use case number 12, and as you scroll down, you should be able to find the download icon for the workbook. Once you open the workbook, let's go to a single worksheet. So for example, in here, how to 1, click on that arrow, and we can right-click on the data source to export the data to CSV. Let's choose migrated data. And in your selected folder, let's save the file. In my case, I'm going to call this 2014 Global Superstore. And we can connect to this data source in a blank workbook. I have an instance of Tableau Desktop open, and I can simply drag over this data source onto my empty workbook. And from here, we can create a worksheet. So let's go to sheet 1. Let's review what we need to do first. We want to be able to compare 2 different years, and we want to compare their cumulative profit for that year. In addition to that, we also want to compare the difference between these 2 years. So for example, for these last points, we want to be able to calculate the difference between 257,000 and 216,000. And we want to be able to graph that and capture that in an area chart. However, one of the challenges for this data source is that the later year, 2014, only has data all the way up to week 34. The previous year, 2013, has data all the way to week 53, so all the way to December. And when we are comparing year to date, we want to be able to stop at the latest date. So this is what we're going to need to calculate. What is the latest date for the data source and use that as our anchor point. Going back to our workbook that's already connected to the data source, let's start by creating a few custom dates. We can do that by script, but Tableau also has built-in functionalities for creating custom dates. So let's take advantage of that. So let's click on date, click on the drop-down. let's create a custom date. Let's create 2 dates for now, one for the week number and one for year. So under detail, let's start with the year. We're also going to choose just the date part. If you need a refresher on date fundamentals, I also have a video that covers a lot of the details and foundation of how to work with dates in Tableau. I'll put it up in the card above and the description down below. So let's choose date part and click OK. Let's create another one. So create custom date, and this time around it's going to be the week number. So for the detail, instead of exact date, it's going to be week number. And this is going to be a date part as well. We simply want to extract the week number regardless of the year that it happened in. So let's click OK. And for the week number, let's convert this to continuous because I want this to be shown as an axis. So let's drag over order date onto our columns, and let's look for profit, and let's drag profit over. Now let's also create a single line per year. We've already created our calculated field for year, so we can simply take that, drag that over to color. Let's also change our sum of profit to the running total or the running sum of the sum of profit. I also have resources and table calculations if you need it. So on the drop down on the sum of profit in your rows, let's add a quick table calculation for now, and it's going to be running total. Now we can see where a potential issue exists. Let's verify first the latest date in our data source. Let's create a new worksheet. Let's right-click drag order date onto text and select maximum date. Click OK. In here, we can see that our latest date is August 23, 2014. So this date right here is August 23, 2014. If the latest date in our data source is August 23, 2014, and we are doing a year-to-date comparison, then what we really want to do is to compare the same duration for the previous year. So what we really want is to compare January 1st to August 23 for 2014 versus this same duration for 2013, which means we need to filter the data only up to this point. So let's create a couple of calculated fields that will help us limit this range. We will use a date function called datePart and ask it to return to us which day number from 1 to 365 a date falls under. We can do this by passing the datePart value of day of year. And we can see in this example, it returns 1 for January 1st and 32 for February 1st. We're back in our workbook. The first thing we need to do is to extract the latest record date we have in our data source. And we can do that using a table scoped LOD expression because we simply need to get the maximum date. So create calculated field. Let's call this max record date. And for a table scoped LOD, we don't need to provide the fixed keyword. So we can simply type in our curly brace. We want the maximum order date. Click OK. And let's verify this first. Let's go to our second worksheet. So right-click drag, maximum of order date. Let's display the max record discrete date. And we can verify in here that our maximum order date that we generated earlier is the same one that our LOD expression is extracting. Now let's create a calculated field. And this time around, we're going to use the day of year number. And we want to compare the day of year of our latest record date to the day of year for our previous year. And we want to limit our scope based on the day of year number of our maximum record date. So let's create a new calculated field. Let's call this within date range. Let's move this a little bit, make this a little bit bigger. So in here, we want to compare the day number of our maximum date with the day number of our order date. So we can use the function datePart. So datePart. The datePart value we're going to use is day of year. So single quote, day of year. Make sure that this is all lowercase because this is case sensitive. And we want to make sure that the order date day of year is less than or equal to. So we can copy this expression over. But this time around, instead of order date, we are going to compare it against our maximum record date. Max record date. Okay, click on apply. This is simply going to give us a true or false value. And once we place this to our filters, we can select to leave only those records where this condition is true. So click on true and click on OK. So now you can see in here that both years are ending on the same week number. Let's validate our profit number. Let's control drag sum of profit to label. And in the label, we're only going to leave line ends. And let's just verify, are these the same numbers we have in the original workbook? We have 257,000 and 216,000, and we can verify that that's the case. So our next task is to figure out the difference between these two numbers, and we want to plot that in an area chart. Now, there are a few ways to get this number. For this particular use case, we are going to use table calculations. What this means is we're going to add another table calculation on top of our running total. And Tableau allows us to do that by using what's called secondary table calculations. So let's just try to expand on this a little bit more. Let's right-click on our sheet and duplicate this as a crosstab because it's going to be easier for us to see what we need to happen for this particular chart. So duplicate this as a crosstab. Let's go to that text table. And what we're seeing in here is simply the tally of our cumulative totals. Now, what we really need to do is for us to subtract our 2013 and our 2014 numbers. So for example, for 2013, we have 8,000. For 2014, we have 2,000, which means our number has decreased by about $6,000. So ideally, we need Tableau to do this subtraction for us. The good news is Tableau can do this for us. So let's drag over another instance of profit. So drag that over to our text table. And in here, we're going to add our two table calculations. So on the drop down, add table calculation. Remember, we're going to need to have a two-pass table calculation. The first pass is still our running total because we want the calculation to be based on our running total number. So in here, the calculation type is still running total. And notice at this point, it's simply going to give us the same numbers that we had before. And it's also worth paying attention to what's happening in our specific dimensions section. Right now, what this means is our running total is going against the direction of order date. So the direction it follows when it's doing the running total is from week 1 to week 2 to week 3 to week 4. It is table across. Let us now add our secondary calculation. So click on this. Let's move this window a little bit so we can see what's happening. So for our secondary calculation type, we do want the difference from, however, we don't want it to compute using the direction of table across. We don't want to subtract week 1 and week 2. What we want to do is we want to subtract 2014 and 2013, and that is actually our table down. Now again, notice what happens to the specific dimensions once I change that compute using value. So in here, table down, notice that what's checked is different. This is going to be significant when we start applying this to our chart. And just to verify the numbers, this is correct. Our 2014 number is $2,000. So this is for 2014. Our 2013 number is $8,000, $8,418, which yields a negative 6,000 result for us. And that is what we are getting. Let us now apply our secondary table calculation in our chart. Let's duplicate this chart. I'm going to press Ctrl and drag sum of profit over. And for the second chart, let's remove the label first. Let's click on the second pill, edit table calculation. And in here, let's click on add secondary calculation. And remember, when we are computing the difference, we don't want the difference from week to week, which is the default for table across. What we want to compute the difference for is between the years. So the direction is along the year. Now we don't have a table down option in here, but we still have our specific dimensions. And we can still specify that our direction is along the year. So we can check that and uncheck what is by default selected. So let's give this a try. Select specific dimensions and check week number, but select order date. Let's close this and let's change the mark type for the second pill to be an area. So on the drop down of the second pill's marks card, let's change this from automatic to area. Let's also annotate the first point and the last point. So in here, right click, annotate, and let's simply display the difference. Let's click OK. Let's annotate the last point as well. Right click on the last point, annotate, mark, and let's use the same format. So let's try to validate this. Let's look at the first point first. In 2013, the value was 8,418. In 2014, the value dropped down to 2,000, which makes for a difference of minus 6,000. Let's take a look at the last point. In 2013, the value is 216,000. In 2014, the value increased to 257,000, which means the difference is a positive $40,000. And at this point, we have covered all the pieces that we need to recreate the original use case using the original dataset. Let's add on to that use case. Let's add the ability to choose which latest date to use, because sometimes we may want to use the latest date that comes with our data source, but in other cases, maybe we want today's date, and those two dates might be different. Let's also add flexibility to see different durations, year to date, quarter to date, or month to date. Let us also allow our end users to choose which year to compare. So in this case, we are comparing 2019 with the previous year. So as we select, the current and the previous year actually change. Note that all of these options will require that we use parameters. In addition to all of these parameters, let's also display our axes as actual dates. In our original workbook, this is showing as week numbers. And as a possible addition, we can also use a highlight action so that we can easily see what the numbers are from week to week. Let's build this step by step. For this example, let's use the Superstore dataset that comes with your installation of Tableau. By default, this is located in your My Tableau repository under the Data Sources folder, the version, and the language that you've installed it in. So I'm simply going to take this Excel file and drag it to an open instance of Tableau Desktop. So let's drag this over, let's use orders, and let's create a brand new worksheet. We're going to use the out-of-the-box functionality similar to what we did in the previous section of this video. So in order date, click on the drop-down, create, custom date. Under detail, we are going to select a year and we're going to choose date part. Click OK. Now let's tackle the date axis. Under usual circumstances, it may be enough for us to take our order date, right-click drag, put that in columns, and choose a continuous date value. In our case, we want to use a continuous date value for week. And let's say we're looking at sales. Let's drag over sales to our row shelf. Now what we want to do for this particular chart is to have one line per year, which means the same month and day, they both exist in the same space, but just represented in two different lines. If we take our year custom date and put that in color, we are going to see a slightly different behavior. So let's drag this over to color. So what this is showing us is the same month and the same day, they will exist in a different place in a chronological time series chart. January 1, 2018 is somewhere there. January 1, 2019 is over there. January 1st, 2020 is over there. And January 1st, 2021 is over there. But what we want is for them to exist in the same space. So what we will need to do is a little bit of a workaround. We're going to need to force each of these years to occur in the same year so that they're overlapping. So we're going to have to force this order date to ignore the years. It's as if all of these happened in the same year. So let's try this out. Let's create our max record date field first. Remember, that is our table scoped LOD. And we are going to use the year of our max record date as the year for all of these order dates. So on the drop-down, create calculated field. Let's call this max record date. This is a placeholder for now. We're going to adjust this later on when we add our parameter. But for now, it's going to be max and order date. And click OK. Now we will create another calculated field that will be based on our order date as well as the year of our max record date. So on the drop-down, create calculated field. Let's call this normalized order date. Normalized order date, which means all dates are recalibrated to the max year. Let's move this first. Let's show our function list. And the primary function we will use is the function called makeDate. We are going to pass it the maximum record dates year, but we will retain the original month and day. Let's close this. Let's add our expression. So in here, it's going to be makeDate. We're going to pass the year of the max record date. And for month, we're going to pass the month of our original order date. And we will do the same thing for day. So day of order date. And let's close this function. Now, one more thing we're going to do is we're going to change the default display of this new date field. We don't want it to show the year in the axes because the year is going to be represented already by the lines. So on the drop down, default properties, date format, let's scroll down. Let's choose this full date for now. And once we select that, the trick is to go to custom and make our own adjustments. In this case, I don't want the full month name. I only want the abbreviated month name. So we can change this to just 3 M's. We can leave the 2-digit day, but we can remove the reference to year. So in here, 3 M's, 2-digit day, and we're going to remove the year. Click OK. Now we can take this normalized order date and replace our original week of order date. So right-click drag on top of the existing pill. In here, we're going to use the week of the normalized order date. Click on OK. And now you can see that all of the years are now overlapping. And as we hover over any of the tooltips, each point is showing the month and the day, so it's not going to be confusing. Let's adjust the line size a little bit. And let's add our running total table calculation. So in sum of sales, click on the drop-down, quick table calculation, running total. Let's also remove the grid lines. So under format, lines, grid lines, let's set this to none. Let's add our first parameter, this choose max date. And this is going to have a value of today or max record date. So in this drop-down, create parameter. Let's call this choose max date. We're going to set this to a string with a list of options. So it's either today or max record date. And let's click OK. We are going to use this parameter with our max record date field. So now we're going to toggle depending on the choice. So let's show this parameter. So clicking on the drop down, select show parameter. By default, it's set to today. So let's edit the max record date calculated field. So on the drop down, edit. Note that right now, this is set to our table scoped LOD expression that extracts the latest record date from our data source. So let's add in a case statement for our parameter. So case choose max date. When the selection is max record date, we need to make sure that we are getting the exact same value that we've typed in. So it's called max record date. So when max record date, if this is the selection, then we want our table scoped LOD expression. When the selection is today, then we want to use the today function. And then end. Make this a little bit bigger. In here, I don't necessarily have to use when today because we only really have 2 options. We could easily just say else in this case. Let's click on OK. In order to test this, we need to create another calculated field that determines if the points are within the selected range. So let's create a new calculated field. Let's call this within range. And remember, in our previous demo, we used the date part function to determine the day of year value of each of our dates. So in here, we're going to use date part. We're going to use day of year as the date part value, day of year. We are going to check if the day of year of the order date is less than or equal to, again, let's copy this expression. And this time around, we are going to use the max record date. So instead of order date here, it's going to be the max record date. And let's click OK. Let's now add this to our filter. So within range, put that into filter and select true. So we can see right away at this point that if I choose today, the lines extend only up to today's date. When we choose the max record date, it will revert back to the latest day of the most recent record, which is December 26. Let us now add another parameter that allows us to limit to only 2 years that we're comparing. Depending on the year chosen, what's going to be left in our chart will be that year and the year previous to that. So it's basically the parameter selection minus 1. Let's create another parameter. Let's call this choose year to compare. Let's set this to an integer value with a display format without the comma. So under number, no decimal places, and no thousand separator. And in here, it's going to be a range of values, and we are going to derive those values from our custom date calculation, which is called order date and in parentheses years. So set values from order date years, and then click OK. Let's show this parameter. Let's create another calculated field that we are going to use to filter our chart. So on the dropdown, create calculated field. This time around, we're simply going to check if it is within the year selection. So within year. And in here, we're simply going to check if the order date years is equal to the chosen year parameter, or if the order date year is equivalent to the chosen year minus 1, which is the previous year. Let's click OK, and let's add this now to our filter. So in here, select true. So if we select 2019, it will leave 2019 and 2018. If we select 2020, then it will leave 2020 and 2019. Let us now add our third parameter for choosing the duration to show. There are 3 values to this: year to date, quarter to date, and month to date. And what this means is the start date of our chart will vary based on the selection of this parameter. For year to date, the start date will be January 1st. For quarter to date, it will determine the quarter that the latest date belongs to, and it's going to adjust the start date to the start of the quarter. So for example, if our latest date is December 30, that is in Q4, which means that the start of the quarter is October 1st. When we select month to date, it will reset the start date to the first day of the month of the chosen max date. Let's create this new parameter. So on the drop-down, create parameter. Let's call this choose duration. This is going to be a string. We're going to have a list. We are going to use the values that we're going to enter in here into a function called DATETRUNC, which will help us determine the first day to consider in this duration. First option will be year, all lowercase. We're going to display this as year to date. Second value is quarter, again, all lowercase. We're going to display this as quarter to date. Third value is month, display as month to date. And let's click OK. I will generate a few more calculated fields. Now I want to show this step by step, but you can also opt to nest a lot of these calculated fields together if you don't want to have too many calculated fields in your workbook. So let's create a calculated field that captures the first day within the chosen range. So on the drop-down, create calculated field. Let's call this first date in range. We are going to use the DATETRUNC function. So DATETRUNC. We are going to pass it the chosen duration. So the dates are going to be truncated to the month level, the quarter level, or the year level. And this is going to be based on our max record date. So in here, max record date. And close this. Let's expand our function list and let's get to know the DATETRUNC function a little bit better. So let's click on DATETRUNC. And in here, what we are seeing is that the DATETRUNC function will truncate a date based on the date part value that we pass in. So this is the date part value. It also returns a date time value. So in this example here, we are passing in August 15, but if we truncate that to a quarter, it will find the quarter that August 15 belongs to, and it's going to return the first day of that quarter. And notice that it also returns the time component. So let's just make some minor adjustments. In this case, we can convert the data type to a date instead of a date time. So we can pass this to a function called date, and we can click OK. I'll create a couple more calculated fields that will help us step through the process. So let's generate a day of year value, so day of year for the first date in range, which will give us a number from 1 to 365. We're also going to generate a date of year number for the max record date. Once we have these two values, then we can determine if the order date, if the day of year of our order date falls within the boundary of our selected start date and our selected end date or max record date. Let us show our duration parameter. Let's create our calculated field for the day of year of the start date. So day of year, and this is for the start date. And this is going to be date part, day of year, based on the first date in our range. Let's click OK. Let's move this to dimension. Let's now create our day of year for our end date. So drop down, create calculated field, day of year, and this is for end date, and this is going to be date part, day of year, and this is going to be based on our max record date. Let's click OK. Let's move this to dimension again. These two calculated fields are our boundary values. You're going to have a start date as well as an end date. And now we can check if the order date day of year number falls within this boundary. So one more calculated field, drop down, create calculated field. Let's call this within duration. And in here, what we are checking is if the date part, day of year, of our order date. Let's just expand our calculated field editor so we can see the full expression. Let's close this. If it's greater than or equal to the day of year of our start date, and if this same expression, let's paste this here, if it's less than or equal to the day of year of our end date. This is going to generate a true or false value for us. Let's click OK first. And now let's put this in our filter. So within duration, select true, click OK. Let's just double check our values. Let's create a brand new sheet. Let's show our duration. Let's display the first date in range. Let's take our max record date as well. Let's also display our day of year start date and our day of year end date. Let's just make this a little bit more readable. So let's take a look at these values, first date in range, as well as day of year of our start date. If we select quarter to date, then it moves the start date to October 1st. And remember, this is based on our max record date, which is currently set to December right now. If we select month to date, then it moves the first date in the range to December. Going back to our chart, we can double check. We have year to date, quarter to date, as well as month to date. Now that we have most of the pieces in place, we can now add our secondary table calculation. So let's duplicate the sum of sales in our row shelf, Control drag, copy it over. And for the second pill, click on the drop-down, edit table calculation. And remember in here, we're going to add a secondary calculation. It's going to be a difference, but the direction has to be along the years. We are subtracting these 2 years instead of subtracting from week to week. So we are going to have to check order date and uncheck week of normalized order date. So let's choose specific dimensions, uncheck week, and check order date, because this is now the new direction. And click on OK. We can choose to make this an area, or we can also choose to make this a bar chart. So on the drop down, create a bar, and under size, we can make it fixed. One more adjustment we can do is we can use our difference as our color. Before we do that, we need to maintain our year of order date because our direction depends on the year of order date. So we don't want that value to disappear. If we simply copy our sum of sales to color, it will remove our year of order date, and now we have an error with our table calculation because it is missing a field that it depends on. So let's undo that. So in here, we're going to keep our order date, but we're going to keep that in detail. And once we have that in detail, we can copy over our sum of sales now. So Control drag onto color. Now we can see all the values. As we change our duration, let's say quarter to date, as well as month to date. Let's check different years. 2019, again, year to date, quarter to date, month to date. Let's now add our labels, but only show them when the points are highlighted. So for the first pill, let's click on the first sum of sales pill. It activates the marks card associated with it. Let's Control drag this pill onto label to display those values. Let's click on the second sum of sales pill. It will activate its corresponding marks card. Let's Control drag that over onto label as well. And now for all of these labels, we want them to only show up when those points are highlighted. So in here under worksheet, we can add our action, and this is going to be a highlight action. We are going to run the action on hover. We are also going to target our highlighting. We want all the corresponding points to be highlighted when they all share the same week number. We're going to leave the order years out. We want the numbers to be highlighted regardless of the year that it's associated with. So let's make those changes. Let's click on hover, and under selected fields, it's going to be week of normalized order date, and click OK. And click on OK from here as well. One more change on the all marks card. Let's select label, and under the marks to label section, we are going to select highlighted, and you will notice that the chart labels have disappeared. So those chart labels will only show up when they are highlighted. There is one more important topic to cover, which is how leap years can affect our day of year number. But let's recap first. At this point, we have already covered majority of the updates we wanted to add to our workbook. We added our parameters, we changed our axes, and we also added our labels that appear on highlight. Let's now talk about the effect of leap year with our calculation. I've simply created an Excel file that has every day of the year from January 1st, 2018 all the way to December 31st, 2021. There is a leap year in this list, which is the year 2020. Let's connect to this data source in Tableau. So drag this over, and there's only a single tab, so let's create a brand new sheet. And before we discuss, let's just set up our worksheet. Let's create a couple calculated fields first. So on the drop-down, create calculated field, this is going to be our day of year. So day of year, and we know this is using date part, day of year, and this is based on a date. And click OK. Let's also generate a marker for our leap years. So on the drop-down, create calculated field. Let's call this leap year. And if the year of our date, and pass it to our modulo function. So %4. If the year is completely divisible by 4, then it is a leap year. So when this is equal to 0, then we can mark it as a leap year. Else, let's just leave this as blank. Else, just an empty string. End. Click OK. Now let us set up our grid. Let's drag over date. We're going to expand this, expand it one more time to get to the month. We're going to remove quarter, and we're going to put the year in columns because we want to compare all the years side by side. We're also going to expand month because we want to see the individual days of the month. Let's also add a filter for month. So on the drop-down, show filter. And in here, let's simply make this a slider. So on the drop-down, slider. And let us display our day of year in our grid. So day of year, drag it over to our worksheet. Let's just make the font a little bit bigger. So format, font, make this bigger. Let's also just display the month in our title. So double click on title. Let's change this and make this into the month name. So month. So for January, we don't have any issues. It looks like the day of year number is the same for all years. When we switch over to February, again, no issues, but as we scroll down, we are going to see the leap year has a value for February 29, and that's going to get the value of 60. So day of year value is 60. Now, what does this do for the next month? Scroll up again and let's go to March. Now we are seeing a one-off difference. Take a look at the value that we're getting for year 2020. Now, this could be minor, this could be negligible, but it certainly does not make our chart precise. Because, for example, if we are looking to compare March 10 to the previous year, using the day of year number will mean that we are comparing this against March 9 of the previous year. There may need to be some discussions around this, but if we want our chart to be more accurate, there are some adjustments we can do. What I'm going to show you is not the silver bullet. This may not be the solution for every situation, but this is something we can consider, again, depending on how we're going to use it. And if we are simply using this to align our display, it may be acceptable. One possibility is simply to add a 1 to the non-leap year years. So in here, in order to align all of them, all of these are going to be reported as 61. Again, please evaluate your own use case, but from a display perspective, this may be acceptable. So let's edit our day of year calculated field. Right-click, edit. Let's adjust this a little bit. And what we're saying is we're going to add a day if it's not a leap year. So if the year of the date, modulo 4, the modulo 4 helps us determine if a year is a leap year. If this expression is equal to 0, then it is a leap year. So equal to 0. If it's a leap year, we don't want to add anything to the day of year number. So we're simply going to add 0. Else, we're going to add 1 and end. Again, in here, we're keeping our original calculation and we're simply adding a value. We're just going to offset that in order to accommodate our leap year, in order to align all of our day of year number values across all the years. If it's already a leap year, we're not going to add 1 to it. But if it's not a leap year, we're going to bring this up by adding 1. So let's click OK. And now we can see that all the numbers are now aligning. This is another long tutorial, but we have seen and incorporated many Tableau concepts. We covered not just level of detail expressions, but also table calculations, secondary table calculations, parameters, highlight actions on a worksheet, as well as discussing the day of year calculation and how it can differ from year to year because of leap years. I hope you found this video useful. Thank you so much for your time and support. I really appreciate it, and I will see you again next time.